Hello class, this is Chapter 2, Measuring and Explaining Crime. The learning objectives we're going to cover in this class are as follows. We will identify the 6 main categories of crime, identify the publication in which the FBI reports crime data and list the 2 main ways in which the data are reported, distinguish between the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, and self-reported surveys. We will explain why income level appears to be more important than race or ethnicity when it comes to crime trends. We will discuss the difference between a hypothesis and a theory in the context of criminology. We will also explain the theory of the chronic offender and its usefulness for law enforcement. Describe the importance of early childhood behavior for those who subscribe to self-control theory. Explain the routine activities of theory of victimization, and discuss the connection between the learning process and the start of an individual's drug use. Breaking down crimes into categories is important for measurement of crime, crime prevention, and victim assistance. There are 6 basic categories of criminal behavior in American law. This is U.S. American law: violent crime, property crime, public order crime, white-collar crime, organized crime, and high-tech crime. Violent crimes against persons, which dominate our perspectives about crime, fall into 4 general categories: murder, sexual assault, assault and battery, and robbery. These acts are further classified by degree depending on the circumstances surrounding the criminal act. These 4 categories are further defined as follows. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being, and it falls into different categories: murder 1, 2, and in some states murder 3. You have sexual assault and rape, which is coerced actions of a sexual nature with an unwilling participant. Assault and battery is 2 separate acts. Assault is the threat or attempt to do violence, and battery is the act of physically contacting another person with the intent to do harm. Now, in some states, these are 2 separate things, and in some states, assault and battery are linked. And then you have robbery, which is taking property from another person through force or threat of force. Property crime is the most common form of criminal activity during which the goal of the offender is some form of economic gain or damaging of property. There are 4 general categories: larceny and theft, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Larceny and theft is taking property from another person without force with the intent to keep that property. Burglary is breaking and entering into a structure without permission with intent to commit a felony. Motor vehicle theft, also known as grand theft auto, is theft or attempted theft of a motor vehicle. This includes any commonly used transport method, but does not include watercraft or farm equipment. Arson is willful and malicious burning of homes, automobiles, or commercial buildings. Public order crime is linked to the consensus model discussed in Chapter 1. Outlawed activities that are considered contrary to public values and morals. They most commonly include public drunkenness, prostitution, gambling, and illicit drug use. This is often referred to as victimless crime because the crime itself usually only harms the offender, like prostitution or illegal gambling. Here's the first discussion question for you to consider. Are public order crimes really victimless? Do you think the government continues to spend billions of dollars to apprehend, prosecute, and sentence people who are guilty of public order crimes? Are there any public order crimes you believe should be decriminalized? And should the focus be on changing social behavior rather than incarceration itself? White-collar crimes refer to business-related crimes. It describes illegal acts or a series of acts committed by an individual or business entity using some nonviolent means to obtain a personal or business advantage. The most recent notorious case of this would be that of Bernie Madoff, which most everybody's familiar with in recent years. Then there's organized crime, which describes illegal acts by illegal organizations, usually geared toward satisfying the public's demand for unlawful goods and services. It implies a conspiratorial and illegal relationship among any number of persons engaged in unlawful acts, and usually employs criminal tactics such as violence, corruption, intimidation for economic gain, and the hierarchical structure of organized crime operations often mirrors that of legitimate businesses. High-tech crime is the newest typology of crime and is directly related to increased use of computers in everyday life. The internet has become the site of cybercrime. It involves the selling of pornographic materials, solicitation of minors, and defrauding consumers with bogus financial investments. Now let's go into measuring crime in the United States. The Uniform Crime Report, or UCR, is released each year since its inception in 1930 as an attempt to measure the overall crime rate in the United States. The UCR is produced by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. This was started under Herbert Hoover. The UCR relies on the voluntary participation of local law enforcement agencies with three measurements: the number of persons arrested, the number of crimes reported by victims, witnesses, or police themselves, the number of law enforcement officers, and it's an annual publication. The UCR presents data in two ways, as a rate and as a percentage. And there are two categories of criminal offenses. Part 1 are index offenses, and Part 2 are index offenses. But they're broken down in two different categories. The UCR Part 1 offenses are crimes that are considered to be the most serious and include murder, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, and larceny and theft. UCR Part 2 offenses are all other crimes recorded by the FBI. They outweigh Part 1 offenses because they are more numerous, but they are generally less serious than Part 1 and therefore carry lighter punishments. There are 19 categories, but the most common are drug use violations, simple assault, driving under the influence, and disorderly conduct. They're measured only by arrest data. There are approximately 10 million arrests for Part 2 offenses annually. The National Incident-Based Reporting System is what we're going to talk about now, also known as NIBRS, or NIBRS. And this is local agencies that collect data on each single crime occurrence within 22 offense categories made up of 46 specific crimes. This was started in 1989 and provides information about 4 data sets: the offenses, victims, offenders, and arrestees. Victim surveys are an alternative source of data collection, attempting to avoid distorting influences of local police agencies. Victims are asked directly about their experiences of crime using techniques of mail or phone surveys. The dark figure of crime means that it results in a victim survey that indicates a higher victimization rate than had previously been expected. In other words, people feel compelled to report things on a victim survey that they might have been hesitant to tell authorities at the time. Researchers believe that a better understanding of the dark figure of crime is revealed through victim surveys. The dark figure of crime is the actual amount of crime that occurs in the country. The National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, is started in 1972 and is conducted by the U.S. Bureau of Census in cooperation with the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the Justice Department. An annual survey of more than 41,000 households with nearly 73,500 occupants over 12 years of age. Participants are interviewed twice a year concerning their experience with crimes in the prior 6 months. It is a voice for victims, and supporters of the NCVS highlight a number of aspects in which the victim survey is superior to the USR, or UCR. It measures both reported and unreported crime, and it's unaffected by police bias and distortions in reporting of the crime to the FBI. It does not rely on victims directly reporting crime to the police. Then there are self-reported surveys, and this is a form of data collection in which persons are asked directly through personal interviews or questionnaires or over the telephone about specific criminal activity to which they may have been a party. Victims may be more forthcoming because of anonymity. Here's discussion question 2. Here you get to consider the following and play the role of crime analyst. Using www.fbi.gov, find the most recent crime rates in your city or the city closest to you. What are the rates for violent and property crime? Do a quick anonymous survey in the class about students' victimization, so among your classmates. Do the crime rates in UCR compared to the victimization rates reported in the class match up? What may be the causes for the differences between the two data collection measures? Discuss trends in crime rates for your selected cities, or consider them. The United States is presently enjoying historically low levels of crime according to the UCR and NCVS. Some theories to explain declining crime rates are improvements in law enforcement, including DNA fingerprinting and information-based policing techniques, an aging population because older people commit fewer crimes than younger people, the end of the crack cocaine epidemic, and the gentrification of former high-crime neighborhoods. Since the 1990s, the violent crime rate has decreased by 50%. Property crime has dropped by 45%. Some of the reasons are longer prison terms for offenders, aging population again, improvement in law enforcement, and also more lenient marijuana laws. As far as crime trends and crime, race, and poverty, African Americans are 6.3 times more likely to be homicide victims than whites, at a high rate of gun violence. In 5 states, African Americans are still 5 times more likely than all others to be arrested for marijuana-related crimes. Racial differences in crime statistics are one of the most controversial areas of the criminal justice system. Now let's talk about class and crime. Lack of education as a handicap faced by low-income citizens seems to correlate with criminal activity. Regardless of race, a person has a much higher risk of violent behavior if he or she lives in a poverty-stricken, disorganized neighborhood. High crime rates in low-income communities are at least partly the result of a greater willingness of police to arrest poor citizens and of the court system to convict them. Now let's talk about ethnicity in crime. Most research focuses on the differences between European Americans and African Americans, but many groups such as Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants from the South Pacific or Eastern Europe have been underreported in crime studies. Americans of Hispanic descent are the fastest growing minority group in the United States. Women and crime is what we're going to talk about now, and 15% of the national jail population is female. 7% of the national prison population is female, and 26% of all arrested in 2014 were females. White women represent a small number of arrests. The number of female offenders in the criminal justice system is rapidly increasing, from 6,000 prison inmates in 1970 to 113,000 in 2016. The criminal justice system's attitude towards women has changed over that time period. Here's another discussion question for you to consider. What are some local, national, or international cases that show the increased involvement of women committing criminal acts? What are your thoughts about how women are handled in the criminal justice system compared to men? Now let's talk about what causes crime. Criminology is the scientific study of crime and causes of criminal behavior. There are different reasons why people commit crime. Mental illness, video games, where they literally take video games and act them out in the real world, and low self-control. And these are not the only reasons. The study of crime or criminology is rich with different philosophies as to why people commit crime. But there's correlation and causation, and there is a difference between the two. Correlation is the relationship between two measurements or behaviors that tend to move together in the same direction, like postpartum depression and infanticide. Causation is the relationship in which a change in one measurement or behavior creates a recognizable change in another measurement or behavior. Postpartum depression does not cause violent behavior. Correlation does not equal causation. There is a correlation between many factors and criminal behavior, and it is difficult to prove that factors directly cause criminal behavior. Now, the role of theory. Criminologists have developed a number of theories that concern the causes of crime. Theories are designed as explanations of happening or circumstance and are based on observation, experimentation, and reasoning. Researchers test hypotheses to determine their validity. Scientific and academic researchers observe facts and their consequences to develop hypotheses about what will occur when a similar fact pattern is present in the future. Criminological theories are primarily concerned with determining the reason behind criminal behavior, but can also provide practical guidelines for agencies of the criminal justice system. So now let's talk about what causes crime. The brain and body. James Q. Wilson posits about rational choice theory that before a person commits a crime, he or she will weigh the benefits against the cost, and when the perceived benefits are greater, the person is likely to commit the crime. That is controversial, because not everybody's wired the same way. Not everyone's brain has those good and bad parameters built in, literally, and we know this now from the last few years of scientific study. Then there are thrill offenders. Sociologist Jack Katz has expanded on rational choice theory by suggesting that the rewards of offending may be sensual as well as financial. He calls this the seduction of crime. Then there's the rational choice theory and public policy. The theory that wrongdoers choose to commit crimes is a cornerstone of the American criminal justice system. Because crime is the end result of choices, policymakers have reasoned that severe punishment can deter criminal activity. Supporters of the death penalty emphasize its deterrent effects, as do legislators using harsh mandatory sentences. Then there are trait theories of crime. Theories suggest that certain biological and psychological traits in individuals could incline them towards criminal behavior, given a certain set of circumstances. That's what I was referring to earlier. Genetics in crime. For example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and low self-control have been linked to antisocial behavior and crime as well. Then there's the brain and crime, neuropsychology, and neurophysiology. Exposure to lead increases the propensity for violent behavior. 6% of juvenile offenders were found to be responsible for a disproportionate amount of crimes. These are called chronic offenders. Then there's mental illness in crime. More than half of all prison and jail inmates have mental health problems. For example, schizophrenia has been linked to high rates of suicide and harm to others. Alcohol and drug use increases the likelihood that people with mental health issues will behave violently. Then there's psychology in crime. People have traits that make them more or less predisposed to criminal activity. Social psychology focuses on how human beings relate to and influence one another. Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, a very notorious experiment that if you don't know about, you need to learn about, focused on aggression in a mock correctional setting. Then there's trait theory and public policy. Trait theory suggests that antisocial behavior should be identified and treated before it manifests in first-time or further criminal activity. Next discussion question for you to consider. Should we use brain scans on children to see if there's a possibility for future criminal offending? And in fact, some of those studies are already being done, and they are finding some interesting things, so you need to look that up. Discuss the pros and cons of brain scanning, and then ultimately, can we ever be sure that someone will offend before they do? If you have any question about that and the social and profound questions surrounding that, watch Minority Report, because that's what it focuses on. Can you prosecute someone for a crime that they're only thinking about committing but haven't actually committed? Now, what causes crime? Bad neighborhoods and other economic disadvantages and sociological theories indicate that crime is a result of social conditions in a person's environment. Then there's the social disorganization theory. Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay studied high crime neighborhoods in Chicago and found that these zones were characterized by disorganization, which is a breakdown of traditional institutions of social control such as families, school systems, or local businesses. Ecological factors that led to crime in these neighborhoods were perpetuated by continued elevated levels of high school dropouts, unemployment, deteriorating infrastructure, and concentrated single-parent families. Then there's the strain theory. Durkheim believed that anomaly resulted when social change threw behavioral norms into a flux, leading to a weakening of social controls and an increase in deviant behavior. Merton believed that anomy was caused by a social structure in which all citizens have similar goals without equal means to achieve them. Then there are social conflict theories. These identify the power or the ability of one person or group of persons to control the economic and social positions of other people or groups as the key component in explaining crime. It's often associated with a critique of our capitalistic economic system. Capitalism is seen as leading to high levels of violence and crime because of the disparity of income that it encourages. Laws reflect only the values of the segment of society that has achieved power and is willing to use the criminal justice system as a tool to keep that power. Then there are life lessons in criminal behavior with social process theories. The potential for criminal behavior exists in everyone and will be realized depending on an individual's interaction with various institutions and processes of society. There's the learning and control theory. Learning theory is popularized by Edwin Sutherland, and it's a theory of different association which sees crime as learned behavior, where the quote-unquote teacher is usually a family member or a friend who exposes the quote-unquote student to criminal behavior. The offender mimics the dominant values that they are exposed to. Then there's the control theory. Hershey focuses on the reasons why individuals do not engage in criminal acts rather than why they do. According to Hershey, social bonds promote conformity to social norms. The stronger these social bonds, the less likely that any individual will commit a crime. James Q. Wilson and George Kelling describe control theory in terms of the quote-unquote broken windows effect. Neighborhoods in poor condition are filled with cues of lack of social control that invite further vandalism and other deviant behavior. Then there are life course theories of crime, believing that lying, stealing, bullying, and other conduct problems that occur in childhood are the strongest predictors of future criminal behavior and have been seriously undervalued in the examination of why crime occurs. If you'll notice, in recent years there's been a very strong emphasis on bullying. Then there's self-control theory. Gottfredson and Hershey believe that criminal behavior is linked to low self-control, a personality trait that is formed before a child reaches the age of 10 and can usually be attributed to poor parenting. These two criminologists ascribe to what has been called the continuity theory of crime, which essentially says that once negative behavior patterns have been established, they cannot be changed. Someone with low self-control is generally impulsive, thrill-seeking, and likely to solve problems with violence rather than his or her intellect. As far as the possibility of change, Robert Sampson and John Lobb have gathered a great deal of data showing that offenders may experience turning points when they are able to veer off the road from a life of crime. Several researchers have studied the role that religion and spirituality can play as hooks for change. Victimology is the study of relationships between victims and offenders and the interactions between victims and the criminal justice system. Now, there's the risk of victimization in that anyone can become a victim of crime. Cohen and Felsen devised routine activities theory to explain this victimization. These three elements are needed for victimization to occur: a likely offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. Repeat victimization. Cohen and Felsen say that offenders attach quote-unquote values to suitable targets. The higher the value, the more likely is victimization. As far as vulnerable victims, illegal immigrants, prior victims are included in this lot. Then there's the victim-offender connection. Offenders are also more likely to be victims. Women as victims of crime. Often in connection with a prior relationship, there is sexual violence, and 6 in every 10 crimes in the U.S. are committed by someone known to the victim. The highest victimization rate is between 12 and 34 years of age. There are other common crimes against women, including domestic violence, stalking, mental illness and victimization, and people with mental illnesses are much more likely to be victims. Mental illness often interferes with a person's ability to find and keep employment and leads to poverty, which correlates with victimization. The mentally ill are more likely to be homeless, which is a circumstance that leaves them particularly susceptible to crime. Mental illness can interfere with the person's ability to make prudent decisions in potentially dangerous situations. Now let's talk about the criminology of drug use. Theories of drug use. Several theories have been proposed to explain drug abuse, including choice theory, trait theory, social disorganization theory, and learning theory. There are drugs and the learning process. Learning the techniques of drug use. Learning to perceive the pleasurable effects of the drug. And learning to enjoy the social experience of drug use. As far as drug abuse and addiction, drug abuse is the use of any drug, licit or illicit, that causes either psychological or bodily harm to the abuser or to third parties. Despite their small numbers, abusers have a disproportionately large impact on the market as a whole. Some addition basics. Extreme abusers are dependent on a drug. When that drug is cut off, the abuser's brain strongly feels the lack of dopamine stimulation, and the abuser suffers withdrawal. In regards to crime and health, the landscape of drug abuse and the drug-crime relationship involves drug-defined offenses, which is violation of laws prohibiting the possession, use, distribution, or manufacture of illegal drugs. Also, with drug-related offenses, there are crimes motivated by drug abuse or committed to further the illegal drug trade. Then there's the drug-using lifestyle, relying on crime as a means of survival outside of participation in the legitimate economy. There's also the impact of drugs and national health. These are health problems associated with drug abuse: a weakened immune system, increased susceptibility to infection, heart conditions including heart attacks, liver damage, brain damage, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. There are 16,000 annual fatal overdoses. Now, with marijuana legalization, the consequences of legalization have led to increased use and further reforms. As far as the future of legalization, it's dependent on diversion and positive impacts. Class, thank you for your time to cover and discuss Chapter 2. Be sure to contact your instructor if you're unclear about anything. We will meet again in Chapter 3.